Okay, we are, and this, I have it properly, the lecture 13. This is the last lecture of the calendar year. And we're going to have a 3-week holiday here coming up, folks. So, I think one of the things I want to just ask you about, since before the break, let's see, this is the 21st, 28th, let's see, we come back, what, on the, let's see, 28th, 17th? Is it the 17th that we come back? Can you, the 24th, and the, let's see, so it's like the 17th, 24th. So the next week you're having your finals? That's be like what, the 28th through the 27th through the 31st or something? Of January, next month? Yeah. Yeah. Your final exams?
And the final exam week is from 22nd week.
January 24th.
That week.
So the 24th, so the following week you were, so we could have a final assessment the following week?
Yeah.
Okay, everybody is fine with that? Okay. Okay. Okay, just get this erased. Get stuff erased here. We're going to talk about the labor market today, another market, the labor market. We're going to continue our discussion on that. And yeah, I sent, what I sent you last week on the one chart had a mistake on it. And I was using the wrong, I used the wrong data series. And I remember when I looked at it, I said something wasn't right and I was in a hurry. So I went back and I fixed it. And it's some very interesting results. You know, this data came out quite recently, so I think some of this came out recently, but this is certainly since the last time I gave this lecture, this data was, this wasn't available a year ago, and so this gives a very good update of what the condition of the Japanese labor market in terms of demographics were in 2015. So that's just 2 years ago. It's a good sense of where the labor market is now. And one of the things we'll see when we compare with we're going to compare the 2015 census with the 2010, we're going to see how rapidly we are now really seeing some very, very rapid changes in the Japanese labor market. And this is going to have a major impact on your careers in this country, because you're going to be entering a labor market that's undergoing tremendous change. It's a labor market that's undergoing a tremendous demographic change. You're a smaller generation that's coming in than the previous one, so you're going to be asked to, among other things, to support more people, retirees. There's a lot more of that you're going to be asked to support. But at the same time, it looks like the labor market's very tight. The labor market, as over the past year, has gotten very, very tight. And so I think you also, and with a lot of economic growth, I think we're starting to see some real economic growth. I think we're finally moving past the Great Recession. I think the Great Recession is becoming a thing of the past. And the problems that Japan has had really for the last 25 years, since all the time that I've been in this country, I think are beginning to come to an end. So it's a very interesting time to be looking at the labor market. And so I think I introduced this, I had this discussion the last week. And so I'll start. If I might have gone over some of this, but let me just start here. And one of the things we'll see is we've got the labor market 2010 the total population age 15 and over was 110.3 million. About 110.3 million that was the age 15 and over, and that's what we say traditionally is the traditional labor force. And that was because at one time, obviously now at 15, most people don't go out and get a job, and so people are really still in school, they're not really in the labor market, but we still traditionally say that. And so we're going to look and see the trajectory of the percentage of people, both male and female, that enter the labor market at sometime after the age of 15. That's an important thing to understand. So what we want to do is we want to look at, here we're going to look at the population that's age 15 and over. And as I say, it was 110.3 million in the year 2010. I think that was the peak. That was a peak value, and we'll see. In fact, let's just the updated figure 2015. You can see it's 109.8 million. So it's declined. It started to decline. The size of the labor force, the total population age 15 and over, is beginning to decline. So we'll have to. One of the things we'll be looking at is when you have a declining labor force, is what are the responses that the country, the society is doing and needs to do and is doing in order to respond to this situation, so that it can afford to pay off, to make good on its promises to the elderly, which will be very important to people like me, because I have earned a pension in the system, and I expect you people to go to work to pay it for me. So I got it. So you'll need to do. Somebody's got to pay me. I want to get paid. So, but there's millions of people now that are going to be going into retirement that you'll have to be doing that. But we're also going to be showing some of the changes, not only people entering the labor market, but exiting the labor market. And we're seeing some very interesting changes happening there, as well as the participation rate of women in the workforce. I talked a little bit about that last week, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that this week. As I say, the first thing is we see the population age 15 and over. There's a majority are women. It's almost 52%. It's a 3.6% margin between men and women, and part of that is that as elderly, a fairly large percentage or a significant percentage of that difference is the result is women live longer. Women live longer. There's more elderly women. When we say that the potential labor force, well, we're also talking about elderly people that are over 15. And past a certain age, past about 70 or so, that becomes very predominantly female. Especially after you go over 80 or so, it becomes increasingly a higher and higher percentage are female. A very important distinction is in the what's called the densely inhabited districts. Densely inhabited districts are districts with 4,000 population per square kilometer or higher. So that is the definition in this country of a densely inhabited district is 4,000 population per square kilometer. So that's 4,000, and that's or greater than 4,000. 4,000 is the lower limit. Now, what's interesting is that by American standards, that's a very high density. You don't even have this density in most central cities in the U.S. Maybe the only places in the U.S. which have central cities that have higher density than that are like San Francisco, New York, maybe Chicago, not even Philadelphia, and I don't even know if Boston does. That's very few cities. Whereas you're talking about, this is a large percentage, 67% of the population lives in places with population density and of greater in a district that has greater than 4,000 per square kilometer. So that's a relative. This is a country, and not surprising. For its size of its population, it's a small land area for the size of its population. It's not, and since 80% of the country is mountainous, and there's not a lot of places in the mountains people can live. When you kind of break it down to where people can grow, where you can grow food, and where people can live, there's not a lot of space left. It's not surprising that the density is a lot higher. But so that means that 67% are in fairly urban. That's a pretty good definition of urban in Japan. Is that 67% are very highly urbanized population. So those are in fairly large cities, fairly urban areas. So that is, and only 33%, less than a third. That was in 2010. Less than a third were in were in non-DID. That's more rural. It's more rural, and some of it is transition and small towns. So it's going to tend to be smaller towns in rural areas. Some of that's going to be mixed in, of course, with kind of suburban, some suburban. But that's you can see very high percentage there. Labor force, non-labor force, 61.4% of the population was in the labor force. So 61.4% were active. In other words, you're active. You were considered yourself as employable and looking for work. That's basically, you're in the labor force. If you are over 15, you're considered potentially employable and you're looking for work. Not in the labor force, 38.6%. Let's compare that with 2015. We can see just the big changes, some changes we can already observe that took place between 2010 and 2015. And look, the DID percentage went up 1%. 68, that's a 1% share. That's a pretty big, what that means is that even though the total population age 15 and over fell, the number of people in DIDs, the densely inhabited districts, actually went up. The urban areas of this country are still growing. And if you look at the real central city areas, the central areas of Tokyo, 23 wards, the central 7 wards of Osaka, centers of cities such as Nagoya, Fukuoka, these populations are still rising. So we're still seeing population growth in the urban centers. But you'll notice no change in the distribution of male-female. But look at the percentage change in the workforce, not in the labor force. That went up 1.5%, 61.4 to 50, now under 60%. So under 60%, only more than 40% now. It went up 1.5 percentage points. 40% of the labor force, 40% of the population aged 15 and over are not in the labor force. And we're not talking because there's a lot of young people. We're talking about a lot of people retiring. And that's, of course, the important point. And now we're going to look, we're going to make a comparison between the labor force and non-labor force. In terms of that labor force breakdown, the fully employed, it was about 78% were fully employed in 2010. Part-time was about 12%. Scattered, the others, you'll notice unemployed was 6%. We'll actually see that percentage is lower. Of the percentage that were not in the labor force, 44% was said to be doing housework. That's housewives, but also housework also includes women taking care of elderly or families taking care of elderly. That's historically, that's been an expectation of society. And certainly I have seen in my generation, certainly the older generation, that the expectation of taking care of elderly parents is still there, even though there's no children. You know, and usually that's supposed to fall on the woman. Usually one of the daughters. Unfortunately, people may not even be having, they're only having 1 or 2 children. that's making a real problem with that. The society is changing more slowly than the change in the demographics. At any rate, 2010, 44%. This 39.8% is pretty much retired. So that's this other, they have an other category, they call it other, the soto ta. They call it other, but it's really, it's interesting that that's, you're retired. The interesting thing, they don't bother to figure out what to call retired, they just call it other. But it's people that are retired. 16% students in 2010. Let's look at the change, and you'll see even there big changes. Look at the change. The housework, people engaged in housework fell from 44 to 37%, and the other went to 47.8% in the other category. That's a big increase. That's 8 percentage point increase in just 5 years. That is an increase. The student population dropped 1 percentage point. Notice how, now the labor force is also one of the things you have to be careful with these figures. You'll see that the figure is a lot smaller. The reason is that in the 2010, in the 2010 or 2015, they have people who didn't respond, and in 2010 they made I think they made a distribution of the non-respondents and made an assumption of who they were, or at least some for the data. Where in 2015 they just separated it out. So that's why the labor force looks small. It hasn't declined that much, but the important point here is that your fully employed percentage is increasing. So increase in it is a bit of a smaller labor force, not as much as suggested by these figures. As I say, that's why the figure looks like it's dropped. It hasn't dropped that much, but you have seen a 1.3% increase in the fully employed, big increase in the number of other, a decrease in the number of people doing housework. And we'll see there's probably a couple of things. One, there's just not, there are not women there to take care of elderly people, and we're going to see that more women are moving into the workforce or staying in the workforce longer. That's an important point that's changed. Now, if you'll notice 2010 in the DID, a bigger percentage of housework. One of the very interesting things that I've observed by looking at these figures is actually that women in urban areas, in cities, actually tend to work less than they have a smaller percentage working than is the case in more smaller towns and rural areas. You think, well, why is that? Well, I don't know how much time you've spent, say at restaurants, in the afternoon, or at the afternoon, or places. But I assure you that if you go to like a lot of lunch spots, there's a lot of women that are sitting around and spending their husband's money. You know, there's a lot of that, and you just have to look around. Okay, this women with a lot of time. And you see that, so there's like an upper middle class of women that don't work, and they're just out spending their, having a good time spending their husband's money. You can go out and see that. So that's where you'll see the figure here. And that's kind of, the interesting thing is you'll see and it's a kind of a social, it's kind of, if your husband is in the managerial class in an urban area, the wives tend not to work. And that's kind of part of it's not easy for women in the workforce anyway. So why make life harder on yourself if he's making enough money anyway? I think that's probably something of what's going on. But you certainly see that, as I say, just go to any restaurant, go to a cafe, and it's the dominant clients, it's dominated by women, and say of a certain demographic where you figure it's their husbands or they're not working, they're not in the labor force. So, but you'll notice that 46%, that's in 2010. But even then, the big decline I'm sorry, yeah, that is in the DID. The big decline in housework in the DID, in the densely inhabited districts between 2010 and 2015, down to 39.1%. So not as big of a drop. It's still a higher percentage, but in other words, these are things that are changing. You're still seeing it, but I will bet that in 5 years or 10 years from now, that's going to become more rare. That this is a generation of women that did not expect to work, they didn't get skills, since they weren't in the labor force, they couldn't really go back, so they just had to spend, their lives sitting around cafes and drinking tea and eating at, at buffet, all you can eat buffets and still stay slim. It's amazing. But that's what, that's kind of the there's a certain culture, but you're seeing that change. And we'll see that. We'll see that in the numbers. And the numbers are showing a change in that. As we say, the DID fully employed 78.7%. In 20, so that percentage has gone up 1.2 percentage points, just like overall. One of the interesting things, as you say, in the small towns, the rural areas, the smaller towns, higher percentage of people work. Very interesting. It's not that there's no work. There's actually more people are working out there, making less money. It's a harder, it's a harder life, and people are working more. And one of the things we'll see this big change. Look at the change, the big decline in the housework. 33% in the non-DID, the percentage of the housework, 33.3%. That went down from 40.4. Look at the other. That's 53.8. A majority of people now, not in the labor force, in the small town, in the kind of outer, perhaps outer urban and small town or rural Japan, are now majority are probably retired. And you can see the overall is only 44%. You see that 44, I'm sorry, let's get that over. That's overall was 47, 44.7 in the DID, and 53.8. And that's one of the things that also tells you out there, what's going on out there out in the rural areas. The smaller towns and rural areas, a lot more elderly people. It's a real struggle out there. We're talking about people that are really, there's a higher percentage that have to work, there's supporting more people retired, there's fewer people to help housework. That means there's a decline in the people that can take care of these people. There's certainly these numbers are talking about a bit of a crisis that's going on out there in the small towns. I know I'm in the big city here. We're in the big city. I don't get out. It's been a while since I've been out and looking around. I suspect that even compared to the last time that I went out, and going around this country and going through small towns, which I've done quite a bit. I've traveled a lot around this country and have done that kind of thing. I think we'll see a lot of evidence of decline since in this decade. At any rate, we'll now look at the breakdown, and this is very important in terms of male-female, because we're going to be talking about a population that is shrinking in terms of shrinking size of the labor force. Well, if you've got a labor force that's shrinking, well, and the number of retirees are growing, you've got potential demographic crisis, and it's something the society has to deal with in one way or another. So when we're talking about the DID, 2010's 87.8% were fully employed of males in the labor force. Almost 88% were employed in 2010. 63.2% of women were fully employed in 2010. As we mentioned, and the DID population, female 51.6. So we've got a majority women, but a minority that are employed. The interesting thing is, look at these changes though. look what's happened in terms of the labor force breakdown of the DID. 90.1% of men are fully employed. Now notice the unemployed population went down 7% to 4.9. So part of it is that there are actually in 2010 there was higher unemployment. Definitely higher unemployment. There were more people than were unemployed. So there are more people that have gotten permanent work in the labor force, especially men. And the women, that percentage has also gone down. It's 6 to 3.6. So you can see it's a smaller percentage of unemployed among women. You can see the change in, actually the number of part-time workers percentage has gone up, but fully employed women have gone up too. You can see there's definitely a shift, an increase in the percentage of women in the labor force. You can see that change. So we're the more women in the labor force, but more men, higher percentage, 90%. That's almost pretty basically almost every. There's only a handful. Anything else, you're talking part-time student, and people that are on sabbatical. That's kind of you can't employ any more men. There's almost no more men you can employ in this country. They're just not there. 90% are fully employed. 90% have full-time jobs. So it's going to have to, if you're going to have an increase in labor force, it's got to come from the other side. Notice how the percentage of women employed in the non-DID, notice how that's a higher percentage. 66% of women are fully employed in the non-DID. As I mentioned, you've got that little bit of a cultural thing, although I think it is changed. We're either seeing change, or we're going to see certainly change in the next generation as the next generation of women are going to be working. But the out in the countryside, the small towns, a higher percentage of women work. And notice how that was in 2010. That was 66%. It's 66.6%. 90.7% of men are employed that are in the labor force. 90.7% are employed in the small towns and rural areas. Everybody's working out there. And a higher percentage of women are working. That percentage is increasing. Fully employed, 66.6%. Part-time has grown a bit. People working hard out. It's not an easy life. People are working hard. More people are working. They're making lower salaries. Cost of living is lower, but opportunities are lower as well. The not in labor force in the DID districts. Now we're going to look at that. Notice here we have the 62% in the DID that were not in the labor force. 62.2% were housewives of women. So that's housewives. That's women that are. If you're not in the labor force, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's female. That's housewives. So the majority, nearly 2/3 were of women in the labor that could be in the labor force weren't. Were housewives. Much smaller percentage of women were retired. And again, part of this is that, or at least the other part of this is that women are kind of being caregivers, so they fall into the house. That's considered housework. If you're a caregiver, you're not in the other category. You're in the housework. You're performing a form of housework. So that 62.2% probably includes some elderly people that are officially not retired because they're taking care of their elderly parents. Notice though for the men how much higher that is. That's 59.7%. This is in 2010. Now we're going to see how that's changed. That changed between 2010 and 2015, and you can see those increases. Look at those increases in both male and female, especially the women. That went up almost 8 percentage points. The men, it went up 7 percentage points. Big increases in the number of those who retired that other are retired. 2/3 of men not in the labor force in the DID zones are retired. They're retired. That means lots and lots of retired people out there. Shrinking percentage of women doing housework out there that are not in the labor force. You can see not much change in the percentage of students along women, but a decline along men. Fewer men are students. Were students in 2015 in the DID areas. Now we're going to move to the non-DID, the non-urban, the more non-urban districts. So already 65% of men in 2010 were not in the labor force. Of the female population, 2/3 that were not in the labor force were female in the non-DID. That was 68% in the DID. So 53% were involved in housework. You can see that's just a little bit lower percentage than in the DID. Oops, there we go. 45.9%. So that is in the non-DID. You can see that percentage. You can see that. So look at the difference here. Not in labor force in DID, 54.5, 33.6. Oops. And 53.8. 62% housework. Look at the smaller percentage that are doing housework in the non-DID. The percentage of males on the labor force is about the same. But also you can see there's more men. That's in, let me just make sure about that. Let me just check this. What is the change in men here? Let's see, there's none, it's not in the labor, at the DID. That's 11, right, see the 11.9 to 13.5? More men are doing housework that are not in the labor force. So some men are taking care of retirees. That's got to be men taking care of retirees. But not as much as women. You can see the big decline in men, in the number of students. But at any rate, we're talking not in the labor force, DID. Okay, that's it, not in the labor force, right? Got that, right? Number of women in the non-DID had not changed very much. And that's interesting. You're seeing much more of a change in the urban area. Urban area 62.2 is 54.5, 53.8. Oh, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. That is done. It has changed. My apologies there. But you see, look at the male non-DID, not in the labor force. 71% are retired. This is like overwhelming percentage of a non-DID, not in the labor force, are retired. But we're seeing an increase in the number of female as well. We can see that 65.5. Smaller percentage of students, more retirees. That's the picture. Now we're going to take a look at, this is a very, very important, we're going to show you a couple of very important charts because these are very indicative of what's going on. First, this is in 2010. This shows the demographics. First, the demographics, distribution of population by age in the labor market, participation rate by age in 2010. That's great. What I love about this data goes down year by year. So you can really do a lot of demographic work, and we can see there's this bulge. There's the bulge. That's the bulge from the baby boom. The baby boom bulge post World War II. There was a baby boom in Japan, and after the war, and here are those people coming through there. I always like asking this question. Does anybody, do you notice that?
What happened?
Look at that. So, what's going on? Why did that happen?
Around 65. The generation around 65.
Yeah, why does that suddenly drop in that one year?
after the,
This was 2010, so you're 64, 64?
now 70, around 70.
Did I do that right? That should be right, yeah. I think that is, let's see, 64, 20, 56, 46, 46? No. Let's see, 46, 60, yeah, 46. I think it has to do with the year of the horse, every 60 years, a year of the horse. It's an unlucky year. Nobody has children in that year, that's it. Yeah, that's it. Nobody had children. Nobody, once in 5 cycle, it's an unlucky year. So it's, you have the year of the, every 12 years there's a year of the horse, but once in 5 cycles is a bad year for the horse. And that was it. Nobody had children that year.
Yeah, it did that around.
I mean, look at that.
Last generation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That nobody had children that year. They just didn't have children. I don't know what they did. It must have been a really tough year. But
Oh yeah, I think so.
you can see the 2 years they didn't have children. I think that's the large. Some of it would have been the effect of the war, but I don't think. No, I don't think that's the case. That's post-war.
Oh,
That was post-war.
Post-war.
Yeah, post-war. But that's rather curious. But this is you'll see the labor participation rate to the right side here. This is, you can see early 20s, or mid 20s, almost 90% of the people are employed. But we see this fall off, and we'll see why. You pretty easily guess. It's not men. It's women leaving the labor force, and then women coming back in, and we'll see this very strikingly. And a slow drop off, and then the late 50s begins to plummet. So then we get that plummeting. So that's what the participation rate looked like in 2010. We're going to see very, not dramatically different, but watch some of the shifts. Look at the shift. Look first on the shift out. Oh, I know, and it's also here. That's this too. That. Oh, let me take that back. That would be just the post-war. This is what I'm talking about here. That's it. 66, 1966. That's the effect of the year of the horse in 1966. I'm sorry. I pointed out the wrong. I think the other was 1946 because of post-war. But this was the. You'll see that. That's right. That's where it is. It's right there. That was from the year of the horse. 1966. Unlucky year. 1966. Once in 60 year, really unlucky year.
Is that Japanese culture?
Yeah. That's why it happened. I know. That's why it happened. Look, that's a pretty big drop off in 1 year. At any rate, but let's look at the change. You can see, look at the ball, look at how that shifts. Look at that shift. There's the shift, you can see the shift, and then the shift out, and look what's coming in. Here's the difference. Look what's coming in. It's not coming. Look how it's leveled off. The number, basically now, you're starting to see that decline. let's see, that's 22, 2015, that's 1993. That's when the recession, the first post-bubble recession was 1993. That's where you're starting to see the impact. A little bit of a recovery, but not much. But we're talking, and this is just going to be, that's going to begin to trend down. It's, it's going to slowly be trending down over time. There's a smaller number coming behind, of young people coming behind. It's smaller, and look at the bulge out at the other end. This tells you a lot. So look at that bulge. It's just moving through, and people living longer. You can see that the elderly, that population keeps on going up, so people are living longer. You can see that there's that bulge there, post-war, the first bulge there, there we go. And nobody's coming behind. But the other thing you want to look at is the participation rate. Look carefully at that. Let's go back and forth. Toggle that. You see that's going out a little bit, and you look at the, see that, the bulb. Do you notice how? Sorry. Do you see how that dip is less? See that? How that dip is less too. That's an important change we've seen, and we're going to go into that very carefully, because it's one of the things that I lectured, the first 2 years that I lectured here, I talked about what Japan needed to do based on the 2010 numbers. Well, the 2015 numbers came in, and they'd pretty much done a lot of it. They were listening to me even before, but before I was talking about it. So it's interesting to see how the society recognized the problem and the adjustments that are being made, and we'll see what they are to bring more women into the labor force. It's real. There's definitely a real positive impact on the number of women in the labor force. And what I've done now, I've broken. Next thing is it's broken down by male and female participation rate, and you can see here. Look at how it gets past like 25, 24, 25. That's almost 100%. Almost every male, almost every adult male is participating in the labor force. Almost 100%. If there's a labor shortage in Japan, there's 0% of that can come from men. But we'll notice here how women, it comes up, this 2010, it's like 23, it's going right up at men, and then stops, and then women leaving the labor force to have children.
Yeah, marriage.
Getting married, leaving the labor force, some of them having children, some coming back, but not all of them. And then leaving the labor force, and then as soon as they come back, they're only back for a few years on average, and then beginning to leave the labor force. So you can see, and this is one of the things I was telling my students, that the past 2 years, this is a real problem. There's a very low female participation in the labor force, and even though they're participating, they're leaving the labor force early. Women were tending to leave the labor force early. Either they were getting pushed out, or they were taken to tend to elderly parents, that kind of thing. So, and with the size of the elderly population increasing, it didn't bode very well for the ability of the labor force. If you don't have workers, you can't make anything. You can't create economic wealth. Can't create economic wealth, you can't take care of people. So this is a society problem. But now let's look and see what happens. Watch this, it's very interesting. This is 2015. And you'll see a little bit of a decline in the male participation rate. But look at how that's come up. Especially, it's much less pronounced. The female participation rate, and notice how that bulge has gone out. It's not just the female participation rate. Women are staying in the labor force longer. So more of them fewer of them are leaving the labor force to have children. More of them are coming back into the labor force. And they're staying longer in the labor force. 2010, 2015. You see that shift, you can see that shift out. Definitely a shift out. So it's a very interesting development. It's a very, very clear development that's taken place in the labor force. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to look at, some of these numbers I've updated. Some of it are going to be based on the previous analysis that I did. And the reason is that I started doing this and I've got to figure out how to present. We've seen, what I'll show you is that there's been a big change, quite a big change in some of the demographics of the labor force in just the last 5 years in terms of how long people stay in the labor force. It's quite fascinating to see this change this rapidly, this quickly. Demographics tend not to change rapidly. They tend to be kind of frozen in place, but we're seeing some real significant changes. At any rate, what I did was I took this data and I said, let's just make some classifications. Let's make some classifications. And what I'm going to do here, I'm going to first show you some of the big picture changes that have taken place. I'm going to show you where the labor force was in 2010. And the next time, in the next lecture, I'm going to put this and update all of this. As I said, I was putting this together and I was trying to figure out, as I realized the amount of changes that have taken place, I thought it might be difficult I'm still trying to figure out how to make what we call an apples to apples comparison between the two censuses. There's been that much of a change. But what I did, I said, we saw that the labor force participation rate rises steeply during the late teens and early 20s, then relatively level, high participation rate, especially for men, from the early 20s to the early 60s, for women a little bit earlier. What I'll do, we'll aid our analysis, we'll create 3 participation classifications based on broad participation rate levels. And I'll say that if it's 0 to 33% participation in the labor force, I'll call that an incidental participation. Just defines what I've done, just defining is that. That's all, it's just the way I've done it. Third transition, the 33 to 66.7, 33.3 to 66.7, is what I call transition. And what that means is you'll see that in this percentage, between these percentages, there's a rapid change. This is not stable in that range. That's a range that people are either moving rapidly in the labor force or rapidly out of the labor force. So that's what I call a transition participation, and it's because you see these percentages at the people transitioning into the labor force or outside of the labor force. And then what I call core participation. The core participation is for over 66.7%. So more, if in an age more than 2/3 are participating in the labor force, I'm saying they're in the core. That's the core group of your core labor force participation. Your work in their prime years, people in their prime years in the labor force. So that's how we're going to break that up. And as I said, the incidental category, and it's typically mid-teens, in the mid to late teens, and those over 70. So those are the 2 age groups where participation in the labor force is relatively minor. It's a relatively minor. They're not expected to be part of the labor force, traditionally. Children, of course, have not been part of the labor force for a long time in developed countries like such as Japan. Elderly have tended to leave the labor force a little bit younger, but typically now, still in their 70s, most people have retired by then. So those are the members transitioning into and out of the labor force. The core category, as I say, in which a large percent of the population tends to participate. And that's the most important part. That's where those are the people who are working, prime years, prime work years. That's the percentage that the economy. That's the percentage that are creating that are creating wealth to raise young and to take care of the elderly. So to raise the next generation and to take care of the past generation. So that's what I call the core participation rate. Now I'm also going to separate out the young from the elderly. And so the incidental I'll call that incidental entering in the labor force, and the incidental exiting the labor, what I call incidental out, transition in and transition out. So I'm going to call, those are terms just to talk about, so we can talk about the numbers of people. What it'll give us is a sense of the numbers of people entering the labor force, in the labor force, and exiting the labor force by age. So that's what we're going to do here. And here's the very interesting, and I updated this. I looked at the data just the other day. And as I was going through this, it's very, very interesting. It's some very, very interesting changes that we've seen. The figures in red are for the figures in black are the figures from 2010. The figures in red are changes that have taken place in that 5-year period. And what we're going to see are some very significant changes. The incidental labor, this hasn't changed. 15 to 18, that's less than 33%. Less than 30% of the population, people are still in school, they're high school students, or if they graduate, or if they left school. Not a high percentage have left school, they're not working. So that's 18. Then you have the transition in, and this is going to be including people that are students like yourselves, that you may not be participating in the labor force. Some of you are, some of you weren't, but many of you, it's kind of a mix. And people who didn't go to university who are in the labor force working, such as my 18-year-old, she's in the labor force. So I've broken this out by male, DID, non-DID, female, DID, non-female DID to see the changes that are at each of these. The transition in the male DID, that hasn't changed between 2010 and 2015. 19 to 22, that's where you're getting out of school, or you graduate from high school and you go to a job, getting out of university and getting into the labor force. Male non-DID, that's increased to 21, from 20 to 21. So even in the non-DID, people are delaying going into the labor force, getting a little bit more education in those areas. The female has not changed, 19 to 21, but a little bit of a change in the non-DID in terms of transitioning in. It's taking a little, 19, 20, now it's 19 to 21. Taking a little bit more of a delay getting into the labor force. This doesn't have much of an impact coming in, because what we're talking about here is, one, it's not a big change, and it's also, it's not going to have people are developing their skills, and that's a good thing. You don't want to force people too early into the labor force when they're really not ready and they don't have the skill set. Here's the core, and this is not in the male, because this hasn't changed. 23 to 64 in the core, in the DID, male DID, non-DID, 22 to 64, pretty much the same. If you're a man, whether you live in an urban area or in a smaller town, rural area, you're kind of working. The large majority of people are working at the same years. But the big change, we talked about for female labor force participation, we've seen a big change. Look at this. This is in the female DID. Remember what I said earlier? You've seen the women sitting around the cafes and all. Well, that's, as I said, I think that's beginning to change. And look at the change in just 5 years. That went from 22 to 54. In 2010, that was the core was 22 to 54. Had more than 66.7% participation rate. That moved out 3 years. In just 5 years, in just a 5-year time, that moved out 3 years. So now that, until the age of 57, it's more than 2/3. That's a shift out. That's a big change. That's a big change. Women are staying in the workforce longer. And look at the female non-DID, it's even later. They're staying till 59. So before it was 57, 22, they're coming a little bit later, but staying longer till 59, so 2 years longer. So 2 years longer, you're getting that higher labor force participation rate of over 2/3. And that change we've observed in just 5 years. So just a 5-year change. So think about how much that's changed and how much is probably changing even now. Women are working, the women are moving towards a career path that's going to look more like men. Look more like the working careers, working years. Now, there's a lot of differences, of course. It's a lot of differences, but there are some very interesting similarities that are taking place. Now, in terms of the transitioning out, this is the men are staying a little bit longer in the labor force. That's 72. That's an increase of 1 year. It's a lot because there's also, remember, there's more men that we're talking about the bulge of the population. So you've got this bulge now that's coming through. They're going to work a little. They'll need to work a little bit longer. They're working. That means on average they're working maybe a year or so longer. And it's really become fairly institutionalized. In many of the major companies, you're given, and you're retired. I talked about this last week. You're quote unquote retired at 58. Then they get rehired at a lower salary. You're kept on with less responsibility, but you're still considered. You're still working in the same firm. And for those people with lifetime employment, that's a very common thing. I have a friend that that's going through that right now, for example. But you can see that again, the transitioning out, women taking longer to get into the transition out, and they're staying a little bit longer to 66. At 68 in the non-DID. So that up 1 year, up 2 years. So in a very short period of time, people are staying longer. In just 5 years, people are staying 2 years. They're staying a couple of years longer in the labor force. That's a fairly large shift. Well, so as I say, one of the things that's doing is it's reducing the need to, at least in the short term, to reduce the size of economic output. You're just going to have more. The society is making an adjustment, and the only adjustment it can make is to have more women work in the labor force. And you're seeing it. There's more. More Hoikuens are being built. Employers are getting more flexible about women working. Being more flexible about taking some time off. Women are more able to have children and continue working, kind of things that have been much more standard in Western countries, but have been less true in this country. But that's we're beginning to see it just out of necessity. Certainly women have been discriminated in the labor force, against in the labor force in the past. And it's just out of economic necessity that's had to be reduced, and you can see that in the numbers right here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and talk about what would have happened, and what would have happened had there not been this change. So what I'll do at our next class. The next class, I'll go over these numbers and talk about the effect of this change, how this affected this change. I started looking at this and I realized, boy, it's just a lot more analysis that I'm going to need to do in order to really properly update this. But I'll be able to get that to you the next time around. I think it's certainly an important issue. It also means that some of the topics that I was planning on talking about we won't go over. It's just, that's fine. This is an important topic. I think this is one that affects everybody's work life. I think that getting a good grounding in this is an important part of your education here. in microeconomics in your first year here. So what I've done is I wanted to understand the population flow into and out of the labor force, the core participation category, to understanding the future direction of the labor market, the future direction of the Japanese economy. And what I wanted to do, what I think the important thing here is we can see this is what policymakers had this in 2010. 2010, 2011, they would have been looking at the data coming in from the census, the demographers and the policymakers looking at this. They would have been able to see what the problems are. And so this is what they would have faced. And what we'll be able to do then is look and see the adjustments that the society has made in order to deal with this. I would have to say that if any of the things about the efforts of Prime Minister Abe, the three arrows, I think the only one that really would have worked was making the labor force more amenable to women working in it. The other things probably didn't really do very much. But this is a major impact. This is a major change in people's lives. And I say, for you going into the workforce, this will kind of tell you what the future of your work life, both men and women, and both as women and as for those of you that will get married, that you'll be your life and the story of your life is going to be a lot different than the generation that's come before you here. Certainly my generation, the people from my generations here would be different. At any rate, here's the expected population flow. So that is the expected to flow. Here was the problem. It was the flow into the core. You could see that this is the people coming up. Smaller group, much smaller than going from the core to the transition. It's about 3 million. So from the core, flowing out of the core to the transition zone is about a 3 million gap. The flow from the transition to the incidental, fairly high. It's a fairly high number. But what you have here is this gap. That gap is they're flowing out of the core and flowing into the core. It's 3 million. That's 3 million missing people. That's a lot of people. When you have a labor force, it's about 60 million people. That's 5% of the labor of the labor force. It's missing. So that's a big gap there. That's 3 million. The difference between the 6 million and the 9 million there. What I wanted to here is show there's a big difference between the DID. The DID are the urban areas. We've seen a lot of flow. If you study this at all, you know that rural areas are really declining. And you really saw that between 2010 and 2015. Now it's real serious shrinkage. And going forward, these areas, these smaller towns in a lot of the country, towns are going to be evaporating. Some of these places are just literally evaporating away as we speak, year by year. Dramatic declines in population. At any rate, so what I want to do here is to show you the difference, and you'll see a very striking difference between the DID and non-DID. And part of this, of course, there's migration from the non-DID to the DID urban areas. You certainly have that because the birth rate's higher in the rural areas. It's a higher birth rate, but more migration. So keep that in mind. More people having children, but they're not staying. And this, I'm not even talking about migration to urban areas. This was just, even if there's no migration, we're going to have a flow into the core that's only about 1 million less. So the gap is primarily in the smaller towns in rural areas. The non-DID, you can see this is the scale. It's just about 4.5, a little bit more than 1 million, maybe 1.2 million. It's about 1.3 million And actually, it would have been lower just given migration, especially by young people. So this was just the, what you would, if there was no change in that, no migration. Whereas the flow from the core to the transition to incidental, this is about in balance. So in the DID, there's about as many people that are flowing into the incidental, the core to transition, and from the transition to incidental. These are people basically leaving the labor force permanently and to a lower rate of participation, so to the transition zone. So that's roughly in balance. So what it's basically saying is it's not really a crisis. It's not a dramatic crisis in the urban areas. And in fact, we'll see once I update this, and we can really see what the interesting thing is to see what the actual flow was, and we'll see the effect of migration and of this change. As I say, I'm still trying to figure out the best way to do that, but probably just keep the same definitions just to show you what the change has been. So we're not talking about a dramatic problem yet in the urban areas. What we're really talking about is this is in the non-DID into the flow into and out of the core labor force. One, it's there's a lot more population, so you can see the magnitude's a lot higher. Look at the gap, and think of it in relative terms. Think of it in relative terms. There's just very little flow. The flow of people into the core compared with the people flowing out of the core into transition is in the non-DID it's big. Not in numbers, it's about the same. But the gap is, in relative terms, it's much higher, and you can see that this flow is less. So there's going to be more people flowing into the transition zone. So you have less of that at the other end, and part of that is people just staying longer in the labor force in the rural areas at that time. And so now we look at male population. You can see in the DID that there's somewhat of an imbalance, about 900,000, but the actual is again is going to be less. The core to transition, it's a little bit more flow in, and this is that bulge that's flowing into the transition then out. That means you're going to have the growth in the transition zone. So since that's higher, that imbalance means you're going to have more flow of men into the transition zone. And for women, and so this is very interesting because the flow into the core and the flow from the core, women core, what was the core in the female labor force, it's going to be less of a gap. So actually, this is an opportunity. It's really, this is where you can see the opportunity in order to effectively expand the size of the labor force by giving women more opportunity to work in the labor force. And I think, the interesting thing about this is for your country, this is kind of the same. China's going to be facing this similar thing, at least in terms of the demographics. Probably not so much in the future as Japan. Not quite yet now, but certainly in terms of the one-child policy, you're going to have some similar, probably some similar issues. But at any rate, the flow here, as you can see, it's not much of a gap, and the flow into the transition is less. And this is just because there's so many women that are in the incidental zone. It's a bigger zone, bigger area, more women spending more time in there, and that's part of the shift that's going to take place, and that is taking place right before our eyes. So the let's see, that is That's the DID. DID, right. So now what I do is go over, this is 2010. The labor force is based on these categories I talked about earlier. Now you want to see where the size of the labor force. This was in the population. This is the total population. This was in 2010. And so what this shows was that your transition in. Look at the huge gap. Transitioning out, 15 million people were transitioning out with a labor force participation rate of 50%. Only 3.8 million transitioning in. That's a huge gap. And the incidental end, it's a huge imbalance between transitioning into the labor force and transitioning out of the labor force. Now, the transitioning out takes a longer period, so that partially offsets the impact, but that's still a big big case. And what it means is, or what it says is, in terms of the labor force structure, what is the economy going to have to do? What would the economy have had to do? In fact, what it appears that they've largely done in order to keep this. This was the problem, to keep this from being a real problem in the short run. So this was the situation in 2010. And as I say, the next time we'll go fully into this and explain it. The labor force structure in the urban the urban districts, it's less of a you look the total. It's a 4 to 1. It's about a 3 to 1. The transition in to transition out, it's a 3 to 1. It's a 3 to 1 ratio. It's not as big of a ratio. It's not as big of a ratio, and so it's clearly, you can see there's less of. It's a problem. You'd obviously like that transitioning in to be higher, but at least you have less of. Now let me check that. We go back. The transitioning out, the total. The other thing is you can see 50% more. The ratio of transitioning out, the transition out of the transition, and transitioning out of the incidental to where really nobody's in the labor force is a much lower ratio than the overall population. One of the things we're going to see is that the demographic structure in the smaller towns is just dramatically different. And one of the things, and I'll raise this question at the end here today. Let's see, we have 15 minutes. 15 minutes left. So in the non-DID, now you can see this huge. It's a huge gap. Huge difference. That's about 8 times. Yeah, about 8 times. The transitioning out is about 8 times bigger than the transitioning in the non-DID. Let's compare that to the D. Again, go back and compare that to the DID. It's a 3 to 1. You see that of transition in to transition out. It's 3 to 1. It's about 8 to 1. Nobody's transitioning in the labor force. There's nobody's coming in. That is a rapidly aging. That's a serious. If you're in the small town, that's pretty grim stuff in the small towns. What's going on there? I mean, you're going to have just the depopulation. It also means there's no workers. There's no workers coming in. You're going to have some skilled work, and you have a lot of manufacturing out in the small towns as well. There is a lot of manufacturing going on. And I guess one question that I would have when I look at these figures is, are the firms out there, are they going to struggle to find workers? But I suppose, and one of the things is that, and I can bring up, I might as well bring up the topic now, is immigration. And it certainly is an issue. What is the how can the society deal with this? And I say this because certainly immigration is a real sensitive, is something really sensitive in this country. I think politically it's still unacceptable to really advocate for immigration. But it's also very clear that immigrants are coming into this country, and that's also very clear. When I go in my neighborhood, I take walks in the park near my home. It's a big park. It's kind of a central gathering point for people. And when I'm working at my desk during the day, and I'll take some time off to go for a walk. And some days when I walk around, it's most of the people in the park are not Japanese. It's very interesting. You've seen a lot of people from Southeast Asia, Indonesians. I think Indonesians, Vietnamese. I'm hearing Vietnamese. Of course, the Indians. You're seeing much more of an Indian. Chinese, of course. I walk around my neighborhood is a lot of Chinese. There's a lot of Chinese in my neighborhood now. It's common to see. Depends on I don't know what in the neighborhoods that you live in, but certainly in my neighborhood, I'm not dramatic demographic shifts. It's not like the U.S. where you suddenly have this tidal wave of immigrants, but it's still I'm seeing the changes, and I'm seeing that there, one way or another, immigrants are coming into this country. And one of the things that, especially when I look at these rural areas, you have a lot of viable companies out there. There are a lot of small companies that are world-class companies producing work for international markets out in small towns. A lot of small towns in this country are like company towns or are dominated. There's dominant employers that are local industries that are world-class firms. And you've got to wonder, well, how are you going to keep workers at these firms? And I've got to figure it's got to be. I think to some degree you're going to have to allow immigration so that there's workers for these companies, and that's where I think you're going to see a lot more immigration, especially from China, as a result of that. Certainly, you're seeing more of that anyway. I'm seeing a big increase in that in the last 5 years. Certainly, big increase in immigration, in the number of immigrants, people certainly in my neighborhood from China. That's certainly a change that I've observed. So these are, as I say, these are the kinds of problems that the great thing when you look at this kind of data and you do this kind of analysis, it gets you to think about, these are real numbers, and these numbers tell, every day people like me get a day older, and we're not going to be around. There's a lot of us at this age and older that are not going to be able to participate in the labor force for a lot longer, and it's going to cause these are changes that society is having to make, and is making. So what I wanted is, so this is the population structure. This is a bar chart that compares the population structure. As you can see, that this is the based on 100% transition in. A huge difference. How much larger is the share of the population, the transitioning into the labor force in the large cities? About the same percentage transitioning out. More elderly people in the rural areas, certainly. More elderly people, but here a big gap. And what this says, the incidental. This is about the same, just because there's more children. People have more children out here. But that's people leaving. That's the effect of leaving the small towns that's migration from the small towns and rural areas into the urban DID areas. And so this is where, as I say, if you're running a company out there, and a lot of those are like industrial, kind of labor, working class, kind of a fair bit of that. That's an issue. but you can see that population structure. And I'll update this, as I say, for the next time around. The thing now I want to go over is in terms of the labor force participation rate, and this will be very interesting to see. You can see the non-DID how much higher. Remember what I was saying about, this tells you the DID, the female participation rate, and it's not because women are having more children. As I say, it is because there's a certain class that is much more has much more leisure than the population as a whole. And you can see that it's reflected in that in terms of non-DID, 76, that's a 4.5 percentage points higher. If you're out in the small town rural areas, you're much more likely to be working than in the urban areas, even though there's more job opportunity. That's the interesting thing, is there's more job opportunity, yet women are less likely to work in the urban areas. It's whereas men, look at the difference, there's a smaller percentage of men not working, not participating in the labor force in the non-DID areas. And I would suspect that what's going to happen eventually, because probably what you have is, one of the things that's going to happen is, and you're beginning to even see, there's a little bit smaller percentage of men working. There's men that hold jobs that probably aren't adding much. There's just, they're men, so they're getting hired. That's, you probably have to add much more, be more likely to be adding value if you're in a small town rural area. This is going to be, I think you're going to see more of a conversion, that the country's going to look a structure that's going to look more like that than like what the country did in 2010, right there. I suppose if somebody had time, you'd want to go back and do this for 2000, 1990, and you'd see the dramatic changes that have taken place in the society. And here is, and I want to go, because this is in 2010, and let me just close up, this is what I'm going to close up here, is talk about this, and then what I'm going to do is come back the next time and update these numbers to close out this this part of the course. But I want you to, this shows you the female labor participation rate as a percentage of the male participation rate for the male core category. This shows that women basically 100% at 23, and the dramatic decline, this is the percentage compared to men, down to under 70% by 35, bottoming out, and then going back a small percentage, going back into the labor force. That is about 8 percentage points. So 8% of the women, after having children and raising young children, going back into the labor force. So you can see that, and for just a relatively short period of time, that early mid-40s to just about a 10-year period, it's really, and obviously in such a situation, women were losing a lot in terms of work experience, and then not spending much time in the labor force anyway. So and if you're not spending that time, you're not able to contribute to the society very much. So that was kind of the situation as recently as 2010. And as I say, we'll go over this the next time and update this. And what I did was I thought about, and I said, well, what would, if you were able to enact the policy, what if you did that would encourage more urban women to participate in the labor force, and that would be greatest for youngest women in the labor force. And I think what we're going to see is, in fact, this has largely been done, and it'll be interesting. What I did here was I said, well, this was the effect of the policy change, and this is what that demographic, what that curve would look like in terms of the percentage of women participating in the labor force. So you can see that there's not much. And let's go all the way back just to give you a preview of that. And you can see that in fact that large, to a significant degree, that happened. That's the thing, you just take that male participation rate, that in fact, that to a significant degree, what I was talking about here at the bottom of what the effect of that policy change would be, I think what we're going to see is that in fact we've seen a lot of this actually took place. So it's very interesting to see how you can, and I said it was a hypothetical. I knew that there was a desire to do it, but I wasn't sure whether or not that had actually happened. So I said, well, let's say make this hypothetical, and what I'm going to be able to show you the next time is, to a large degree, in fact, this is what would have been nice, and it would have increased the size of the labor force over what it would have been if the structure had stayed the same. And in fact, we've seen a significant increase in the actual size of the labor force from what it would have been as a result of these structural changes that have taken place since in just the last 5 years. And I'm sure even now as we speak, if you go around town, you're seeing they're building more in Hoytland, women's opportunities in the workforce are expanding. That whole role of women in the labor force is changing, especially as an older generation of men retires. I will close at that, since we are coming up on the holiday season, and I'm going to be at least play a little bit of Santa and give you 3 minutes off, 2 minutes off. But Santa is gives, Santa, but I'm going to be a little bit of, you know, the Grinch who stole Christmas, the story about the Grinch, the evil Grinch who stole Christmas. Well, I'm going to be a little bit of a Grinch. I will give you some assignment, some exercise work to keep you busy during the otherwise you'd be just having to sit there like my 15-year-old. All she does all day long is sit and watch YouTube videos. I just feel so sad for her. She seems very happy though, but I feel sad. At any rate, we'll have a very good holiday period, and we will see you in 3 weeks' time. And as I say, have a plan to. We'll have the final assessment sometime after probably the last week. It looks like the last week of January.